Welcome to another episode of the Futurebuild Podcast, where we explore the forefront of innovation and sustainability in the built environment. I'm your host, Martin Hurn, and today we have a truly inspiring guest, Alastair Parvin, co-founder of Open Systems Lab and the driving force behind the groundbreaking WikiHouse project. Alastair has dedicated his career to rethinking how we design, plan, and build our communities. From open innovation to disruptive manufacturing, his work challenges traditional paradigms and seeks to democratize the construction industry. Today, we delve into his career journey, his views on sustainability, the innovations that excite him, and the importance of collaboration in driving impactful change. Plus, insights from his recent article on the future of planning. Alastair, welcome to the Futurebuild Podcast.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure to have you. I wanted to start off and really sort of talk about your career journey and what got you into architecture and maybe what moved you out of it as well.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to the second one. I think, so I sort of went to study architecture, was training in architecture. I think I realized quickly that there was a kind of mismatch between what I think your expectations of architecture might be and the reality of it. And I think all architects are to some extent familiar with that. And I think what became pretty clear to me pretty quickly was that architecture is kind of operating at the end of the food chain, and that it's sort of bred for frustration in the sense that you're dealing with a bunch of deeply important issues to do with place and the built environment. And when we look at those big crises that we all know we have to face, we all face like housing crises, climate crisis, the obvious ones, but really almost every kind of major issue manifests itself in place and the environment, right? And yet architecture was kind of pretty peripheral to all of that, actually. And I realized you can't do this building by building, right? So I think it kind of pretty quickly began to dawn on me that actually, put it another way, what I began to realize pretty quickly is, I was kind of going through architecture school, and then I was very fortunate. I went to work for Richard Rogers for 2 years, and this was sort of during a boom time, right? This was kind of fantastic times in a sense for architecture, but everyone I spoke to was really unhappy in a way, because they were saying, actually, the buildings we're creating are rubbish. Like, not a Richard Rogers, by the way, it was brilliant. But we'd meet up and they'd say, oh yeah, my client keeps making me make the ceilings lower and take the balconies off and isn't really taking carbon seriously, et cetera, et cetera. And I think at that time, a lot of the tendency is people say, well, it's bad design. Oh, why is everything, why can't we do design well, et cetera, it's bad quality. But actually, when you really start looking in, you ask yourself these questions and you really start looking into it, you realize actually it's a function of, there are a bunch of systems that underpin the built environment and underpin the way we do architecture. What I mean by that is how we build, how we design, how we plan. And actually, if we want to tackle any of these challenges, we're going to have to redesign those systems. And actually, so then you kind of logically follow, okay, whose job is that?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do you think this is synonymous though with maybe the changing role of an architect? And I personally think that, I had a young architect on yesterday, and what was evident there is that the climate emergency and biodiversity emergency is breeding a new type of architect and maybe bringing a new appeal to architecture as well.
I think so. I think one of the things you realize, a nice way to think about this, by the way, is actually think about what is an architect.
Yeah. And
if you go all the way back to, for example, the ROBA Charter, the original ROBA Charter, and look at the original text of it, it says, okay, and essentially what it is, it's got like the King or the Prince of Wales' signature, whatever, on the bottom. What it essentially is a quid pro quo. It says, here I confer upon this group of people the protected title of architect. But in exchange, there's a quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo is you are taking, and it's not worded like this, right? It's worded in slightly more kind of highbrow, old-fashioned language. But it effectively says, The reason we're doing this is because we're giving you a responsibility for knowledge and effectively society in the built environment. So it says, I think the exact wording is something along the lines of being an art, which has, I'm misremembering the wording, but it has essentially effect on absolutely everyone. And we have a common interest in the built environment. So the quid pro quo of that charter is, yes, we give you the title of architect, but in exchange, you now have a civic responsibility for essentially a body of knowledge around society and the built environment. What's really interesting about that charter is what it doesn't say. It doesn't say anything about what the business model of an architect should be. It doesn't say anything about, oh, you're meant to do drawings of buildings for clients, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's really interesting, right? Because suddenly the moment you step outside of the kind of normative existing business model that as it's received, because you start going, hold on a minute, we can't do this building by building. We've actually got to fundamentally rethink this whole stack of systems. The moment you do that, there'll always be someone who'll say, oh, that's not architecture. And I would argue that actually, if you go back to the original founding charter, it's exactly the duty the architectural profession has put upon it. So the duty upon us is not, architecture is not, it's not a guild, right? It's a professional civic responsibility. And essentially the responsibility that falls on us is to understand and to solve these challenges. And the interesting thing is, you can start with almost any of the challenges that you want to, right? But some really big, obvious ones: climate crisis, housing crisis, right? Start with almost any of those and just start pulling on that string. Say, well, why is it that wealthy countries have a housing crisis? What is that? What does that mean? And you kind of hit the standard kind of go-to first order solutions.
Yeah.
There's a great government paper by the Government Office for Science in 2013 had this wonderful phrase, like the debate about housing in the UK is bedeviled by rival oversimplifications, right? And that's a good way of understanding it. So, and you start pulling on that thing, and you pretty quickly realize, oh yeah, wait a minute, there's a whole system under here, and we're so busy blaming the players or looking to political leaders to solve that problem. But you say, well, actually, this really is a function not of the players, but of the game, right? We are locked into a series of systems that are man-made systems. They were designed, but not by us. We just sort of inherited them. A lot of these systems are inherited from, 19th, 18th, some cases even 11th century systems, and we're just kind of running them. Yeah. And you come back to this thing, it's like, oh, right, okay. So actually start with almost any problem in the built environment, whether it's health, care, the quality of our environment, climate, carbon, you name it, affordability. You pretty quickly realize we're going to have to, that there is no way to do that without applying the same kind of design thinking that as an architect you might apply to a building, but you're pulling that string. Yeah. And now as a designer, you're kind of, this is where I found myself, I'm not an architect anymore, I'm a sort of designer of systems.
And tell us a little bit about that work. Actually, you went on to co-found Open Systems Lab.
Yeah.
And sort of for those that don't know, and and I've looked through your website, and sort of how would you describe that, and what is its sort of mission and value?
It's a really stupid idea. It's like, if you want to make any money, don't set up a non-profit R&D lab. That's my first advice. So in a way, it was somewhat born out of WikiHouse, which is our main, the kind of main project. So Open Systems Lab is a non-profit R&D lab with a focus on essentially researching, understanding, designing and deploying future systems, particularly around the built environment. And it's very difficult to say where the edge of that works, but we're really interested in the stack of systems that really underpin places. So construction systems, design, procurement, planning, land ownership and property. That's the kind of formulation of it. It is a commercial, it's not a charity, it's a commercial company. We just don't have shareholders. So basically our job is to kind of work for everyone effectively, and just to try and take on these problems and produce useful useful stuff. Most of what we produce is open source, so public goods. In other words, we would describe it, we work for everyone, right? So when you're trying to shift a whole industry, you kind of are trying to produce stuff that the whole industry can use.
And then you mentioned WikiHouse, and it'd be great to touch on that. I remember vividly actually seeing it outside the building centre, I think, displayed in their courtyard. Tell us a little bit about that, but also maybe why that came about. What systems were needed disrupting for that to exist?
I mean, like all good solutions are the solution to a lot of problems at once, right? I think where WikiHouse came from, this was when I was with 00, and effectively we were really interested in lots of things. I was very interested in, I'd written this work on right to build, so how do we make it much, much simpler for anybody to build zero carbon homes? And particularly this idea of the obvious point that the way we build hasn't really changed that much for a very long time, and it's completely obsolete, and we need to kind of modernize that. But then onto that, I was also kind of fascinated by the way that open source had transformed the software industry. So these completely different ways of working and different ways of doing knowledge. And I think a lot of people at that time were kind of really interested in this architecture, so we didn't know exactly what that would mean. And I think the aha moment behind WikiHouse was digital fabrication, and particularly the CNC machines. They dropped significantly in price to this point where you could get these a 4x8 CNC machine that could cut a material like plywood or OSB for really like a few £1,000s. And that's a potential game changer, right? Because we suddenly realized that actually the moment you do that, you can start to have building knowledge which is shared as code. So we can literally take design knowledge and put it on GitHub, like open source code, that you can then take that code and then effectively fabricate these precision-made components in really, really small factories, almost anywhere. And then you could essentially produce essentially it's like Lego for real buildings, right? And so that it began as an idea, and then it was this sort of long, sort of 10-year journey from taking it from being hey, this is an idea about what the future could look like, to no, this is actually a mature product and it's here right now.
And so that's taking, low carbon, sustainable materials, and building it locally as well.
Yeah. So there's a couple of big differences, WikiHouse versus, I mean, everyone there's a kind of running joke, right, which is that like off-site fabrication has been the future of building for as long as anyone can remember, right? There's this kind of ongoing.
I was going to ask you about some of the barriers. Why hasn't it scaled? And
back to that, because they're really important, right? But we've seen these kind of successive attempts to try and transform the way we build, and in a sense, WikiHouse is no different from a lot of other DFMA, so design for manufacturing assembly style solutions. The two big differences with WikiHouse is one, of course, that it's open source, and two, that this idea of distributed manufacturing. So we realized that what tended to happen in the UK is that you'd get investors who come in and spend many, many millions of pounds building these fantastic factories that can turn out houses like on the kind of Fordist model really, really quickly, super, super efficient. But again and again, they would then fail because of the way that the UK land and planning system works. You just don't have this regular, reliable pipeline. And so particularly in the UK, you'd end up with these factories that are sitting empty, basically, costing thousands and thousands of pounds a day. And so we realized this is a fantastic opportunity to effectively do for manufacturing what Airbnb had already done for hotels, right? And plenty of other things, which is to instead use this distributed model where you have a distributed network of small micro factories that people could set up for £100,000, and in fact a lot of them are already there, right? So there's already this network of CNC fabricators who are doing fit outs, furniture, all sorts of stuff. And so it's like, wow, there's this distributed factory capacity that's not tied to a single product. And sure, they may not be as efficient at making houses, but there is this resilience and this effectiveness there actually is perfectly efficient enough. So you can still manufacture an incredibly well-made, precision-made series of components that can be rapidly assembled on site in like a day or so, without spending £100 million on a factory up front. So that's a kind of big part of it. The interesting thing you say about the carbon is kind of interesting, because we were obsessed with this problem of making it very simple. And weirdly, when we first started working on WikiHouse, we saw using bio-based materials, timber, and trying to design for circularity, so making sure it was designed for disassembly, and so these components could be taken apart, reused, only dry fixings, etc. We kind of didn't see that as the main selling point. We kind of saw that as hygiene, right? Of course, that's what the future, we all know, we've known for ages, that's what the future of construction looks like, so of course we should be doing that. What's strangely happened, and to begin with, the early adopters of WikiHouse have been self-builders and things like that. But what's weirdly happening more and more is, as more and more people are waking up to the issue of embodied carbon, now oddly enough it's becoming one of its main features, because suddenly a load of people are turning around going, oh my goodness, how are we going to build at zero embodied carbon, or even less, depending how you think about it, carbon negative. Oh man, there's going to be so much innovation. And we're like, oh, turns out we've already put several years into doing this innovation. There's a system right here. It works.
And with traditional bio-based materials as well.
Right.
And I saw, I was reading the website on it as well, is that, I think a stumbling block or a barrier, or a perceived barrier, I think, for building, these low carbon homes has always been cost. But in this case, it's actually cheaper or comparable to.
Yeah, I mean, our target has never been to make it cheaper. This is a really interesting thing, coming to the barriers. Our target's never necessarily been just to make it cheaper, but to make it cost comparable. Yeah. And that's what most people need, by the way. Like, most people want to build, the right way, basically, but it's very hard for them to justify that if it's significantly more expensive. So from our point of view, it's always been, let's at least get to a point where it's kind of, you've got cost parity. I think we're just about, oddly, in a kind of rather depressing way, history's come in our direction, because of course bricks and stuff keeps getting more expensive. Yeah. There is a twist though to that, which is, now we're getting right into the weeds of transforming construction, right? Which is, you can come up with a really good DFMA building system, a modular building system, and the problem that's still waiting for you is what we call the procurement problem.
Yeah.
So and Bryden Woods, for example, are super articulate on this. Done some fantastic reports about that. And there was a great Bryden Woods report a few years ago, which included this great graph, which showed that actually every pound we spend in the public sector building buildings, only 51p in that pound actually goes on the buildings. 49p is going on the cost of overheads, cost of procurement, risk, these other costs. Right? So we have a similar thing in the world of DFMA, which is effectively, you can take a technology like WikiHouse to, it's really easy to kind of design. It's very, very predictable kind of pricing, etc. in terms of the materials, the manufacturing. You can take it to a manufacturer and they'll be like, yep, no problem, we'll manufacture these blocks, and you get these things. You take that product through a conventional tendering thing, you take it to a contractor who's not used to seeing this stuff like that, and they say, what's this? A technology that makes my life easier and quicker and improve. That's going to cost you, because it's uncertain, right? So they've not seen it before. So and lots of people are encountering this. So this is really the next big challenge that we're kind of working on, is then building out and scaling a supply chain of companies behind WikiHouse who are using it, who are familiar with it. Because once they've used it for the first time, they go, oh yeah, we know that we can build out this quickly. Because effectively what you're doing is, with manufacturing, you're paying a little bit more upfront, but then you get those savings back later through the fact that you can build so much faster. Everything's straight. This is a fascinating thing. I'm having this wonderful party. A self-builder built a house and invited everyone who built to a party at the end. I was speaking to the guy who'd done the plastering on the walls. He says, I've been a plasterer for like 30 years now. I've never done a straight house before. Right? And so it's like, and we were like, you don't need to skim these walls, it's fine, because everything's just straight. So that's where you get the savings back, but that you only get those savings back if you've got this kind of level of vertical integration, and you've got a company who's done it before and knows what it will. So what we have with WikiHouse now is we have a pretty fantastic network of manufacturers spread all over the country who are ready to manufacture your WikiHouse block. But our next mission is we want to partner with installers and suppliers. So these are companies who will do you a complete design and build service and contractors, right? So now they're out there, they exist. And so this is another really interesting thing about transforming the industry. And what I love about WikiHouse is, as I always say, we don't want to create one company. We want to create 100,000 companies. So so that actually there's a lot of companies in construction in the UK who are like, actually, we know we want to modernize. We want to use modern methods of construction, etc. We want to be building circular. We want to be building high performance buildings, but we don't have the money to do that upfront R&D, like all the innovation that's involved. Yeah. Hugely expensive to do all that R&D from scratch. And so this is a kind of a big difference with WikiHouse. It's like, don't see WikiHouse as like, a company that you're kind of competing with. WikiHouse is yours if you want to use it, okay? So what we're doing now is having these conversations with the sorts of companies who are doing, often they're like timber framing companies or SIPs companies, or they're providing bespoke, a sort of turnkey or design and build style building like services, and so they will help you through deliver your project. And a lot of those today might be using sort of not often they might be using conventional, that's the wrong word, conventional construction methodologies like brick, but a lot of them aren't. They might be using say SIPs and timber frame. They can say, okay, let's start adopting and let's start using WikiHouse, start working with WikiHouse and become a WikiHouse supplier, basically. So that's our kind of next big mission, really, to try and solve the procurement problem, which is a problem that the whole industry is now facing. And we once again find ourselves back in this situation collectively where we all know this is the future, and yet the headlines keep reading again and again, prefabrication companies goes bust, prefabrication company goes bust. So I think that's why we've got to kind of do it together, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you think there's a sort of also need to maybe, especially in the UK, fix the self-build market?
Yeah.
Because it only accounts for around 7%.
Yeah.
Compared to 50% in countries like Netherlands.
Yeah. So that was actually, oddly enough, the first piece of research I did coming out of university was a thing called a right to build, which was exactly focused on how we do this. So the big reasons why, so yes, that's first let's set the scene for those who aren't familiar. The UK, so most mainland European countries, the rate of self-build is about 50% or more of all housing. Austria is about 80%.
Oh, wow.
What we mean by self-build is not literally that you have to build it yourself, although of course with WikiHouse that is an option that people love to do some of that stuff themselves.
I know, I heard you do it over a weekend with your friends, which is a great selling point.
Exactly, it's just a lot of fun. But you still get the electricians in afterwards. Literally just means that you would buy a plot of land and commission your house and purchase a car in the same way you might buy a car or something else, right? You don't physically have to make it yourself. So yes, UK has so mainland Europe about 50%, UK about 7%. That data is a bit old, so we don't know exactly, but it could be even lower now. The big reason for that isn't actually the construction or procurement problem. It's largely to do with land and planning. We do not have a steady supply of serviced permissioned plots in the UK. So we and there's this great organisation called NACSPA, the National Association of Custom Self-Build. And for years they've been doing things like taking people over to Almere in the Netherlands and showing them this fantastic example of what's called a proactive or infrastructure first planning, where effectively the local authority or a development corporation is buying up the land, usually at pre-planning values, installing the infrastructure first, right, which of course is much more popular with local communities because actually it means that the new development is coming with schools and nurseries, etc. And then you could buy, it's brilliant, right? You could buy a plot of land. So they then sell off these plots of land, some larger ones, some smaller ones. So, but then as a group or as an individual, you could buy a plot of land that comes with a set of planning rules already on it, and then you can just build your own home. And this is one of the paradoxes that in the UK we talk all the time about, we've got to build more homes, and paradoxically the the term build more home defeats itself, because it almost undermines its own goal. Because oddly enough, the irony is that actually, if government really, really wants to increase the number of homes, and sort of, well, how, right? If we really, really wanted to do it, one of the ways we could do it right now would be to go on a national plots program.
Yeah.
Effectively would say, yeah, we're going to release 100,000 plots a year. And this is much closer to how things work in France and the Netherlands and things like that. So, and that would unlock this huge, incredible thing for the construction industry, right? Because suddenly, actually, you create this booming, vibrant market of companies who are competing to make you ever better homes for less, accompanied by a really fantastic design and delivery service. And guess what? Of course, when people are building homes for themselves, and they're the ones going to be paying the heat and the bills, they're the only ones today with the director's incentive to be building the best homes they can, to be building the most sustainable homes that they can. And that's what we see again and again and again. It's always, those self-builders, those community builders who are building the really fantastic high performance stuff, because they're the one with an incentive to do it.
Absolutely. You talk about quality, and it takes the power away from the house builder or the developer, and absolutely puts it in the hands of the homeowner.
The weird thing is, I don't think this is not necessarily an either or. We need more of everything, right? What's weird to me is flip it the other way around and say, well, why aren't we? Why aren't we? There's this huge group of essentially frustrated potential house providers out there who we're not giving them the opportunity to do what they want to do, which is hugely popular, incredibly good for innovation in the economy, and is going to be a very responsible, sustainable form of construction. So why wouldn't we do that? And again, because
we've seen it in the sort of the early adopters of the passive house standard are all the self-build side, because it's the passionate people that want to build their home of the future.
Yeah, and it's not just passionate. It is that, but it's even not just passionate. Partly it is, you've got a direct incentive. Whenever I've now spent many, many years basically weirdly spending my time studying and obsessing about these complex systems that underpin our built environment. And in the end, it always comes down to incentives. There are no bad guys really out there. Every time you see something, so actually when you look at the incentives, it's completely understandable what almost everyone's doing. But the really interesting thing is say, well, look around and say, well, who is incentivized? And by the way, house builders, the major volume house builders, have always been arguably the most honest and articulate about this. Or if you go back to the Calcutt Review, they say, no, we're not in business to serve the public interest. We serve our shareholders, and this is how our business model works. And collectively, we keep not listening to them. So say, let them do their thing, but actually we can't be relying on them to do something that they have no incentive to do. They have no incentive to release homes faster than it's in their interest to do so. They have no incentive to build better than it's in their interest to do so, right? Whereas there is this big group of people who are directly incentivized to build things. And there's two things going on there with your self-builders and the passive house, right? There's the direct natural incentive of, hey, actually, turns out I want my energy bills to be low. And if I can afford to get those down, I will. But also, of course, is that once you get to that point of cost parity, everybody wants to do the right thing if they can afford to.
So, it's interesting because, we talk a lot about, barriers to innovation. And then a lot of that comes from, our regulations and legislation. And I think there's been a tendency, and I think a good example of this is when they pulled zero carbon homes standard, that we were at code level 6. We've shown it. I had Martin Townsend on recently. We were talking about the BRE Innovation Park, and there were exemplar homes there that were showing that we could do it. And then suddenly house builders resort to building to the standards that's in front of them, or they have to.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that's a lot to do with, I think we don't have a great, collectively we don't have a great understanding of how the land system works and how land valuation works. So the way that it works is it starts with what a property's worth, and you subtract from that the costs. So all the money we need to build better homes is already here. It's in the land values, right? All the knowledge we need is already here because the industry has proven for decades that we know how to do this collectively. But you do need to, one way or another, you've got to look at the incentives. And so if you're a developer, there isn't that much of an incentive to build to zero carbon unless the regulations make you. And it would be a really easy thing. We could just, we do that. But, basically governments don't like the idea. They don't want to bring land values down. I think is, that thing. But then the other thing is, the other way to do it is then say get the land into the hands of people who do have an incentive to do it, because they're building homes to live in, not building homes to sell.
We've got to build communities, and I think it's worth probably touching on obviously new Labour government, big aspirations of house building, muting 370,000 compared to the 170, 190 that we're currently doing. You're doing a lot of work or a lot of thinking around planning in particular, and it's probably worth touching on that because that's been, hotly debated at the moment about, giving those to planning rules. What's the work? Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing, but also maybe your reaction to, what's currently happening in government.
Yeah, so the work we're doing on planning, the way I always put it is, you, me, probably everyone listening to this is listening to this because we're all really interested in the what of planning. In other words, places like should we have greenbelt, all these sorts of things. My kind of basic take on this, as is consistent all the way through talking about systems, is that actually, if we want to change what we plan, we need to change how we plan. And that's the big transformation of our time. So when you actually look into how our planning system works, right, it was created in 1947 before computers or the internet. And although so it was based on this document, this idea of, documents, hugely laborious kind of process, also a discretionary process, right? So in the UK, we're very unusual that we have this consent-based system, which I always say is a bit like the referee in a game of football saying, I'm not going to tell you what the rules of the game. You have to ask permission every time before you kick the ball. It's completely understandable why they did that. It's clearly not working, right? The result is exactly as chaotic and expensive and exclusionary as you would expect it to be. And I'd argue actually in a whole bunch of ways, it's actually structurally undemocratic because it's not trusted by people. And it means that if you are a small player, the planning system is this prohibitively huge barrier to you, because it's this, this huge unknown, this huge risk, huge amounts of hours and hours that have to be spent on a consultant just to navigate the basic stuff of it. So we're really interested in effectively saying, essentially our planning system was designed before computers or the internet. Its operating system was basically forms, paper, drawings. And today, although we've put those forms and those paper and drawings onto computers in the form of PDFs, fundamentally, we haven't changed the basic operating system. And hey, the web is here. So we have this fantastic opportunity to shift to fundamentally rewire the operating system of our planning system from documents to data. Yeah. And that's happened in the rest of our lives. When you buy car insurance, when you book a holiday, or do pretty much anything, or every day we're using these database systems. It sounds really kind of a bit esoteric, but it's the exact opposite, right? Because once you've got systems that are data and rules, you can build incredibly user-friendly interfaces. So we got really interested in this, and we came up with this idea. We had this fantastic opportunity to start working with Southwark Council. We've been working with Future Cities Catapult. They put out this open call for ideas, and by pure coincidence, Southwark put in exactly the same idea as us, right? Which is brilliant. And they said, hey, you should probably speak to each other. So we started working with Southwark on what we call a kind of rules as code planning service. So the first thing we made was this prototype for what's called Plan X, which is it's got a service called Find Out If You Need Planning Permission. So you can go on, you put in where your property is, what you want to do, answer a few questions, and it will tell you whether or not you need planning permission against all the various legislation, case law, etc. that you have to go through, right? So suddenly, from a situation where even to do a quite basic thing to a building today, so like add an extension or add a heat pump, right? Today is a national policy goal that we want people to be adding heat pumps to their homes. And yet, if you actually try and do it through the planning system, it's incredibly complicated. You've got to navigate multiple different websites, multiple different forms. You don't know what you don't know, right? So it feels like a bit of a minefield.
I suppose you don't know who to go to either.
And you don't know who to go to, right? Yeah. So actually what these digital services are doing is they bring all that into one place. So it's just things like find out if you need planning permission. This is my a property. This is what I want to do. I want to add a heat pump to my home. Okay, here's the bits of legislation that apply to your thing. Yeah, okay, you need to apply for planning permission. Here, you don't. And we're what's amazing now is that it started as a thing working with one council, then with 3 councils, then a whole load more councils, and actually now MHCLG were kind of like, hey, what are all these councils doing? This is really interesting. And so they started throwing their weight and support behind this, which is fantastic. So we're now working with, I think there's 23, I think, councils, either live or going live with these services. And there's a bunch more coming down who are coming down the pipeline on building these services. And they're not just, it's not just the kind of guidance services like Find Out If. It's now also things like apply for planning permission. So actually you can build those, I hate the word smart, but I'm going to use it now. You can build those smarts, that knowledge that's actually baked into these services to make it much, much easier to navigate through that process. Now, what's really cool about that is also, for me, one of the big end games is creating tools that can move us towards this more transparent, more rules-based planning system. And that's beginning to happen. So one of the councils in particular, there's a few councils who are exploring this now. One of the councils in particular has developed a design code. So they've got this large estate of thousands of homes that all are going to need retrofitting. And they've done a design code, which is like conventionally in a PDF, right? And so they've taken that and they've written it into a planning service. So you can just navigate that really quickly in a few minutes on your phone. And so not only will it say whether you need planning permission, but if you do need planning permission, it'll say whether your proposals are comply with the design code or don't. Now that it's going to be a slow process because planning policymakers and planners are not used to making rules-based policies, right? So if you read most planning documents and planning policies, they're full of quite fuzzy language, like, neighbourhood visual amenity must be considered. What does that mean? No one really knows. So actually part of the again, it's all about quid pro quos, and we get the kind of quid pro quo we go to planners with and say, look, here's the trade-off, which is that if you want to make your life easier as a planning department, not have to be spending thousands and thousands of hours doing all this other work, dealing with failure demand, etc., then you've got to publish some rules that say explicitly what are the outcomes you actually want. But the quid pro quo is you're in control of those rules, and those rules can be as nuanced as you want. You can have as many if this then that's to them as you want. And actually, to their great credit, a growing number of planners are going, yeah, hold on, this works for us. So this is a win-win, right? Because it's a win for people who are using the planning system and having to navigate the planning system, but it's a win for planning authorities as well, because the burden on planning authorities today is just insane. We were shocked to discover when we first started working with like Southwark, one of the first things they said to us is, about 70% of the phone calls we get to ask the same question, which is, do I need planning permission to replace my windows? Wow. Like, what? Right, and around half of all planning applications received are invalid, so they have to be sent back. I.e., before you even assess them, it's like, oh, there's information missing, or the north arrow on the drawing is missing, or something like that, right? And so we've got rid of that now, because now you can just submit that as a digital outline instead, so you don't need to submit a document, a drawing. So the great paradox of planning today is that most of what we call planning isn't actually planning, right? It's development control, and even most of what development control is doing, it's pretty boring, mundane work. If you actually hang out with a planning officer and follow them around for a day, you realize that most of their work that they do on a day-to-day basis is nothing that you and I would call planning. It's responding to emails, getting, requesting this other bit of information. So actually, if we can do something about that, we can also massively free up lots of capacity. And one of our kind of pet slogans is let planners spend more time planning.
And you take out the nuances and the ambiguity.
Sorry?
And you take out the nuances and the and the sort of.
Well, the thing is, in a way, we're saying you don't have to take out the nuances. I think so. One of the reasons why planners would feel quite defensive of our consent-based system today is the good bit of it is it leaves room for nuance and local character and case-by-case things, right? But actually what you find when you get into it is that there's a kind of an 80-20 rule, which is that, there are and there always will be some cases that are really, really kind of unique and different, but 80% of cases that's not true. 80% of cases they fit within a kind of range of parameters. So you can still write very nuanced rules, and even so to begin with, some of the rules in planning are already out there. So the permitted development rules are already rules. But even once we're getting into those policy local plans and local policies around sort of household works, whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be black and white. So explicitly, those councils who are taking, for example, things like design codes, we say, yeah, look, actually there's 3 flags in Plan X that you can use for things like that. There's a red, a green and an orange, right? So actually as a planner you can say, yeah, certain things red, we would never even consider consenting this. Certain things green, yeah, you're absolutely compliant with everything that we're looking for here. Orange, okay, this is a bit of a special case, we'd have to reserve the conventional thing. And that immediately, that's 80% of the thing. You can make people's lives so much easier. Even just the simple stuff of not having to read through a whole document, because if you pick up a document, a planning document, I can pretty much guarantee that 80% of it doesn't apply to the thing that you want to do right now. So just shifting that from a documents to a data environment, even that just makes people's lives easier. So it's not going to happen quickly or slowly, but I think one of the points we're making here is we don't have to be stuck into this false binary choice between cutting red tape to make stuff easier, but then and then having good regulations that can deal with nuance. Yeah. Actually, we can have both. We can have transparent, nuanced rules, if you like, that can deal with all the things that actually the public good outcomes that planning wants to deal with, and we can make life much easier. And that comes from this approach of being really kind of borderline obsessively interested in the how, in the underlying systems of how we work.
So the end goal, where does Plan X sit? Does that become the planning portals on each of the individual local authorities' websites? Is that literally the first point?
It can be. I mean, essentially, you've spotted a one-trick pony here. Essentially, we would describe Plan X is essentially like Lego, but for building digital services, right? So you can see there's a Lego theme underpinning our work here. We're going to get emails from Denmark. So councils are using, actually what's really interesting is that once you give that to councils, a lot of them are spinning up their own services, sometimes beginning to happen outside of planning as well, which is really, really interesting. Because actually it's just giving them the tools that they need to say, actually, we have this problem, let's build a service that does that. But straightforwardly at the moment, if you want to submit a planning app, I think something like 90% of planning applications are submitted via the planning portal today, and that's fine. Planning portal is of course was privatized, so it's now a private company.
Oh, right, yeah.
So people still think of it as a public service, but it's actually a private company. But there's no reason why you can't submit planning applications through any journey. And what Plan X does is it allows councils to essentially invite people to submit their things directly through these services that also give them this guidance and make their lives easier. So if you are someone who submits planning applications often, keep a lookout for on your council's website. If it's one of the councils who are adopting Plan X and using these services, give them a try and give your feedback. So all the services have feedback buttons, and this is how you build these. I can't tell you how unimaginably complex it is day to day working with how do you not just build a thing, but actually fundamentally transform a system. And it's never really just about technology, right? It's about people and organizations and working with those organizations. And one of the ways you do that is just by continuous agile development. So you're continually listening to feedback and what people are saying. So, oh no, this doesn't work for us because, this really small niche issue over here.
And you've chosen probably one of the hardest, slow-moving, bureaucratic.
Because that's the problem that needs solving. That's the thing that a for-profit company would never be stupid enough to take this up.
Wouldn't touch it. Instead, on the X theme, you've developed something called Build X, I saw.
Yeah, so it's really bad. The lesson here is don't use working titles for stuff because they stick. So Build X actually came before Plan X. So it's a piece of software. It's still very experimental, but it's really, really interesting. So going back to the, WikiHouse, you can describe it as an an example of transforming the way we build. But then pretty quickly after that, you get into this thing of the way that we design and the way that we procure, right? The reality of the way that we design buildings today is kind of insane when you think about it, that we effectively draw a sketch on a napkin without any idea of how much it will cost and how much, whether it will stand up. And then you hand it over to an engineer who says, no, that won't stand up. And so back to the drawing board. And then when you finally get it to stand up, you hand it over to a quantity surveyor who says, no, that costs too much. So you've got to go back to the drawing board. So the reality is today that not only are we designing every building from scratch every time, we're designing it from scratch several times over, right? Which is kind of crazy. Yeah. So the opportunity of productized building systems like WikiHouse is that you don't have to do that, right? You can have a modular, essentially, system of parts that are pre-engineered, so we know exactly how that building component is going to perform. We know that piece of wall can support 13 tons if it needs to, and so forth. We know exactly how much it will cost because this is the price of materials this week, etc. And so you can bring that predictability. So it's like, hey, what if we took the kind of parametric design tools that we're all using on our desktop software and actually tried to bring them into the web? Much simplified, right? Really stripped down in terms of their complexity. Actually, weirdly, we started Beldex early on. We made it too complex. Right. And we were just cooking people's browsers, basically, trying to run really complex parametric stuff in the browser. There is some really interesting projects, by the way, doing really cool stuff. Look at things like Speckle in the browser. But we said, well, actually, we can simplify this and it still be useful. So Buildex is essentially, imagine you're looking at a little, you can go into and put in your site outline. You can go and look at a library of standard house types, or you can start your own, and you can just start stretching, moving the windows, changing the materials, and it's instantly calculating or estimating based on the best data we have, how much it's going to cost, what the embodied carbon is going to be, and if possible, the energy performance, although we've taken that out for now because that's really quite tricky. Now, of course, there's no limit to how far that could go. So we're starting, weirdly over time, as we've been working on this over several years, we've made it, oddly enough, simpler and simpler. But we're really interested in that as a tool for not just WikiHouse, but other modular building system companies. But as ever, we're going to guinea pig that on ourselves. So, but hopefully before too long, on the WikiHouse website, you will see this little configurator where you can just be designing. And at the end of that process, you can hit download and you can export a 3D model, a complete list of all the blocks that you need.
And have you got the sort of simplification that even a child could design a house?
You have no idea how much hard work goes into making something that simple. So that would be the dream. I'm not going to be arrogant enough to say that we've got there.
We've both got 7-year-olds, so maybe we test it on them. You talk a lot about sort of rethinking and disrupting the norm, and I just want to sort of delve into sort of what innovations you're seeing at the moment that have got the capacity to do that. What's exciting you at the moment in the built environment?
Yeah, this is really interesting.
Outside of what you do, of course.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think one of the things, we tend to fall in love with the problem more than necessarily the solution. So there are some really interesting technologies, but as Cedric Price put it so perfectly, technology is the answer, but what was the question? Yeah. And actually what we tend to see is unbelievably exciting technologies being asked the wrong question, or not having the right sort of operating system environment. So again, if you take something like parametric design, take kind of some of the amazing spatial data that we can get now, our capacity to know stuff is extraordinary, right? There is enough knowledge out there right now to know like what is going to be the health impact of almost every design decision that we make. And we've known this stuff for years, right? Like, we know that patients with a view of greenery from their hospital beds recover faster, right? But that stuff we're not deploying it. Yeah. It doesn't make its way into construction contracts. It's too difficult to deploy. It's a really good book I recommend. It's called The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, talking about checklists in surgery, right? So they introduced pre-flight checklists like pilots use into surgery. And one of the points that he makes in that book is effectively there's more knowledge in the world today than any practitioner can meaningfully hope to actually use on a given rainy Tuesday, right? And that's exactly where we're at with the built environment. So we know what the challenges are, and we have these amazing technologies and tools out there.
Yeah.
But it's not hooking up. I bet most of us are not actually, drawing down on that kind of environmental performance data as we're designing. We're still paying a consultant to do that. So there's a kind of institutional layer to this, which is actually how do we pull that data together? How do we use the web to reorganize ourselves, to actually to begin to kind of unlock this? So when you combine the potential of data and parametric technology and, for example, various forms of artificial intelligence, it's insane. But frankly, most of the technological capability we need to do stuff that is almost unimaginably cool to us now has actually been around for a long time. We're just not using it. For me, the most disruptive piece of technology in the built environment is the World Wide Web, and it's been here 30 years or so, and we're still not really using it. If you think about the potentials of linked data, so take something like BuildX to say, actually, we should be able to be pulling on data from an API that says, actually, we can pull in some great soil data about that right now, and then we can know actually what is the current price of this bit of steel. That we can't do that stuff because that kind of data market doesn't exist. So I think that that's my kind of focus is not specifically on the technology. There's loads of really, really exciting technology out there, but it's more saying, well, how do we redesign the way we organize ourselves so we can actually start deploying some of these technologies at the service of the big obvious problems that we all know we've got to solve.
It's fascinating. I'm a big fan of Rory Sutherland, who did a book, The Alchemist, and and he talks a lot about you could fix HS2 because the problem isn't that we don't want to get to London 20 minutes quicker.
Right.
Actually, we just want a better experience on the train. Yeah. So actually, if you took, whatever it was, 30 billion and said, well, he could fix it for 3 million by just making the trains nicer or having a more comfy seat or better Wi-Fi. Yeah. You'd sit on it.
And by the way, Rory is brilliant. I kind of know him, met him a few times. I know him a bit, and I mean, he's brilliant. He's so articulate, but he's also superbly good on. He's also essentially a Georgist like me, by the way. If you're looking into this, the economist Henry George. It's the kind of whole for the people who feel politically homeless. I don't know if I'm left or right. It turns out a lot of people probably would describe to Henry George's ideas as I do. Mostly, but he's really incredibly also articulate on the absurdity of our housing system and the housing crisis, and talks about the fact that how look around you and I right now. Look at the cameras, the microphones that we're using. The technology has leapt forward in terms of so much better, and it costs so much less than where we were even a few years ago. And then look at housing. We've got the exact opposite problem. In housing, we have homes that cost more and are worse, right? He's amazing.
And the design's gone backwards,
right?
You talked about, one good thing about the self-build market would bring character back into communities.
Right.
Where at the moment we build characterless communities that are poorly built and current standards which aren't future-proof.
Yeah, and it's kind of not rocket science. I always say that the true measure of quality in the built environment is not pounds per square meter, but hours of attention per square meter. Yeah. That's really what we mean by character.
Yeah.
Right? So, hey, surprise, surprise, if you give power to, again, I'm quoting Cedric Price, give power to the fine tuners, right? Give power to the people who have lots of hours of attention per square meter. And of course, that's what you get. And, again and again, you go and you find places that are really lovely, and they're often lovely because they're loved, and they're loved. They're loved because they're lovely, and they're lovely because they were loved. In other words, they were very much made by the people who go there, and that's who live there. I think it's really interesting, for example, that we've normalized the idea of owning a home. Well, we're unnormalizing it in the sense that so few people can do it, right? Yeah. But we haven't really fully normalized the idea of a neighborhood as a thing that owns itself. And yet what's really interesting, I remember speaking to Stephen Hill, who's an amazing advocate for self-build and community-led housing, and many years ago, and one of the first things he said to me is, I was like he said, I was a judge for CABE. And, we go around all these schemes. And again, the places that were the best, most lovely places, it was nothing to do with the buildings. It was the space between the buildings, right? And the difference was actually that the people who are going to live there can make decisions about the design of a place that a developer never could, right? So developers got to go, oh, right, now I've got to go for the lowest or lowest risk option, basically, which is car butted up to the front door of every house. Whereas actually the community say, actually we'd be fine. We'll just put our cars together over there, and we'll have this lovely green space in front of our houses. So that's a huge deal. And maybe we should circle back here to some of the big challenges that we're facing. Of course, as I said, there's challenges because almost every crisis that we face today, health, care, etc., it manifests in places and neighborhoods and buildings. Right?
Yeah.
But there's some obvious ones that are leaping out. The housing crisis, and what do we mean by that, right? Which is really this kind of dysfunctional land and property system. And the other one, obviously, is the climate crisis. We're doing pretty well on energy performance of buildings now. Yeah. I think that there's still a lot to be done, I think, on not just on first on retrofit, but then also renewables. And again, there's a missing scale, which is a lot of, if you speak to a lot of engineers, there's actually community scale. There's a lot of stuff you can do at the scale of 100 homes that you can't do at the scale of one. Yeah. And that's really interesting. So where's the institutional there for that? But the other, obviously, the two other kind of big ones, if you look at the UK Green Building Council roadmap, is obviously embodied carbon, then the transportation carbon, right? So these are kind of really interesting points because, so let's go into embodied carbon. It's completely insane to me that we are, a typical house today we're building is still spewing out 30 to 50 tons of carbon dioxide in its production, and it's completely avoidable.
It's coming from the use of traditional materials.
Right, because it's coming from basically brick and concrete. Yeah. So if you actually look at the breakdown of the carbon emissions of a typical house, the moment you use bricks and concrete, boom, you just spaffed it. It's gone. And it's not rocket science, which is, hey, we need to build with stuff that's grown rather than mined for that. Yeah. But there's lots of really interesting stuff people are doing around lower embodied carbon bricks and concrete, and that's fine. But it's very interesting that that news planners, for example, are really behind the curve on this because a lot of saying, we want bricks. And it's like, well, yeah, you also have a policy around climate change, and a lot of it, it's not malice or even incompetence. It's literally they don't know, they don't realise that happens. So we get quite a few inquiries to use WikiHouse on projects where people are like, oh yeah, we want to build this because we want to get to essentially carbon negative. And then we want to add bricks on the front. So, well, why would you do that?
And that's coming from aesthetics or a perception of fire legs?
It's a mixture of all these things. And bricks are beautiful, right? They've got the human scale texture. They're they're robust. They're fireproof. So I think this is a great big challenge for architects right now: is come up with other really beautiful, robust ways of cladding buildings. Are as beautiful and as robust as bricks. And there's lots of cool ideas out there. So I think that is a pure aesthetic challenge, but it's a really, really fun and interesting one because certainly with building systems like WikiHouse, you can kind of clad them in anything you want within reason. Yeah, and of course also with WikiHouse, because it's a lightweight timber building system, you don't have to be using concrete foundations, right? You can be using screw pile foundations, and which can also be reused at the end of the building's life generally, or at least recycled. So that's a big saving there, right there in carbon as well, because the moment you use bricks are really heavy, so you need really big concrete foundations. So embodied carbon is obviously one of the big ones, and as the grid is decarbonising, embodied carbon is becoming a bigger and bigger percentage, and we can do that. We can do that tomorrow. Pretty much all the technology we need to be doing that is already here. What we need to be doing is building the supply chains, building the capacity, the incentives, the regulatory systems, etc. around that.
And scaling some of the biomaterials as well. I was looking at, you're a lot, an advocate, especially through WikiHouse, of hemp insulation in particular, and that just seems like a no-brainer and something that's got to scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're seeing some great, Indie Nature, I think is one that you guys use, and there's Grown, and there's, huge amounts of different brands now.
Yeah. So obviously the whole approach of WikiHouse is it's a modular system, right? So we try and make it agnostic, right? So we say you can use any foundation, any insulation, any cladding, any window, anything, right? So because that kind of separation of the different elements of a building is really helpful for people. So can use what we like. But as you say, in each of these fields, there are emerging amazing innovations, right, around insulation, and we've got to properly. Now is the time to seriously lean into these and say it's time to grow up now. These are not alternative futures anymore. This is now, like, if we're serious about the carbon commitments that we've already made, we've got to do this. And then actually, when you encounter the problem, like some barrier, you say, well, okay, what do we need to change this? I won't go into it. There's a whole kind of fascinating thing I found whilst working on planning, where there's a rule in the permitted development things that says materials must match. When you build an extension, well, a typical extension built using brick emits about 10 to 15 tons of carbon. So I've been sort of making the case for, hey, look, if we just remove that line, the Scottish don't have that line in their development regulations. If we remove that line, it's literally the savings could be tens of huge tons of carbon.
Although when we do listed buildings, they want the extensions to look extraordinarily different.
Yes,
so
exactly.
We see a lot of time a glass join.
I raised this exact topic in a group of people around planning and said, hey, by the way, do this. And I expected there to be pushback from a conservation point of view. And exactly as you're saying, the exact opposite happened, which is that the kind of conservation architects in the room were like, And actually, from a conservation point of view, we would always advocate for that clear distinction between old and new. Because it's better anyway, because the materials almost never match. So once you take this mindset and we really set ourselves to the mission, you find there's so many bits through the system where we can begin to make these changes and begin to kind of unlock that. And then, of course, the other, to kind of bring us full circle back into the world of planning, is that, again, if you look at that carbon roadmap, a big chunk of the parts of the carbon emissions that are responsibility of the built environment are neither operational carbon nor embodied carbon, but essentially transportation. And of course, the built environment and planning in particular has a huge role to play. So this is another really big case for moving towards this sort of infrastructure first approach to development. So instead of kind of building these kind of sprawling kind of suburban neighborhoods that eat up land and, as we've said, kind of spew carbon. Actually, what we really need to be doing is building at gentle density around which at that point you can fund new public transport connections, which are funded by the land value uplift. There's a really nice report, I think it's called Vision-Led Planning, which Create Streets really fantastic on this stuff, did on exactly these things, and saying actually land, we're fundamentally a small island in the North Atlantic. Land is a really precious resource. So it's in everyone's interest to make sure that when we do build, we build at decent mid-densities. And that is a huge part of reducing that other segment of the carbon costs and saying, actually, let's get to a point where everybody can get on a bus or has protected cycle lanes, etc., nice walkable streets and neighborhoods. There's shops and schools within range, etc., etc. We can absolutely do this, and we can make our lives a heck of a lot better in the doing of it, and massively boost our economy. Like, all the pieces that we need to do this are already here.
And we've seen it. Let's talk about Bedsed as an example of that. That was built 20, 30 years ago. By Z Factory, and it's an absolute exemplar of that. I always joke as well, every time when my children were young, we used to go to centre parks, and I was like, wouldn't it be amazing if we just lived in a centre park?
Right.
Because there's no cars, and it's really cool when you park your car in a big car park, and you can go around and it's in the forest, and you just feel great, and health and well-being aspects. And
it's a point that Christopher Alexander made as well, which is the irony is that we live in kind of little stacked boxes of real estate or whatever, but then when we go on holiday, we seek out places which have like vernacular architecture, no cars, etc. Say, well, wait a minute, guys.
Why can't we have that all the time? No, you're great. We always end the podcast. We could talk for hours, and we always end the podcast around the sort of theme of impact. And one question I like to ask is around sort of who's had an impact on your career. And you've worked with some amazing people. You mentioned Richard Rogers. You've obviously work very closely with Indy Johar as well. So it'd be great to sort of talk about some of those individuals that have had an impact, but also who's coming through. Who's those future leaders that are sort of you're like, oh wow, that person's going to make a great impact.
I mean, where do we start? There's a lot of people. We're all functions of every book we've ever read and every person we've ever spoken to and been inspired by. I think and I very much stand on the shoulders of a lot of giants, really, in terms like Indy and Cedric Price, Christopher Alexander, Jane Jacobs, all those people. They had it, long before all this stuff worked out, long time ago anyway. I think one of the interesting things goes back to like, where is leadership coming from in the built environment? And one of the things that we see, particularly as an organization that is working across these systems, is that we are only able to have any sort of impact at all when we are working with companies and organizations locally who are doing amazing stuff. Would obvious examples to kind of pull out would be Civic Square in Birmingham, IMI. We Can Make Homes, and in Bristol, led by Melissa Mean. So there's every piece of the future exists somewhere and is being done by somebody against the grain, right? They're sweating like hell to actually land and realize and demonstrate the future. There's a great quote by the economist Kate Raworth. She's great, and I think in her book she says that the economics of the 21st century will be practiced first and theorized later, which there's a truth to this, I think, and this is exactly what's happening, is that when actually what you see is this kind of completely different approach to how we do development, how we do planning, how we do placemaking, and these little full stack examples happening here and there, which you can point at. And also what's cool about those is that they are, from our point of view, is that they're opportunities to prototype. Now the key thing you have to know though is that how hard it is for them to do that stuff, right? Because they're going against the system. So and again, it's not malice, right? It's just the fact that organizations are like big machines. They're designed to do the same thing over and over and over again, right? So the moment you do anything that's slightly different, everything becomes exponentially hard work. We have I don't know who first came up with it, but there's a phrase that we use within the WikiHouse project, which is called the rule of pi, which I find really useful, which is that basically the first time you do a task, it's 3.14 times longer and harder than the second, third, or fourth or fifth time that you do it. So I definitely would look to some of those to those organizations who are prototyping. There's also great organizations doing this around retrofit, right? So community organizations who are buying up homes and retrofitting them, et cetera, et cetera. And actually what they're doing there is they're solving not just the technology problem, but the systems and the institutional design problems underneath, and saying, actually, how do we rewire the incentives?
The community retrofit's really interesting. I remember Assemble doing a lot of that in Liverpool at that point.
Yeah, and certainly from my point of view, like if you want, from a national perspective, if we really want to take these missions seriously, it's a really good start is to go and find the places, the people that are doing it, right? And actually sweat and learn, because you're not going to get it right first time. Yeah. We're going to have to work out what are these barriers. And then when those people tell you there's a systems barrier, set up a team to go and sweat that system barrier, right? And to actually go and work out, okay, how are we going to rewire that? And that this is kind of, whichever way you choose, you find the other one waiting at the end of the corridor in a sense. So you say, right, we want to go and deploy this here. Oh, it turns out we need to go and fix the planning system. Okay, let's get a team on that. But it's an incredibly optimistic way of working. And I obviously say, I say this all the time, but I don't think there's ever been probably a more exciting time to be a designer. Like, I don't know if you had this, but this is kind of a weird thing to admit, but when I was little, I sort of thought, oh, isn't it going to be a bummer because everything's going to be solved? right? Like, and it's like we're going to go out and everything's going to be done, and all the problems are going to be solved. Turns out that's not the problem. And this is why I always find it amusing when it comes to things like technology. You get people saying, "Oh, are the robots coming for our jobs?" And it's like, what? Like, we are facing a challenge. No society has ever pulled off anything like this before, right? If we're saying, no, seriously, where's a zero carbon city anywhere outside of like Bhutan? There isn't really one.
Yeah.
Right. So we've got this monumental challenge on our hands, which is how do we create beautiful, abundant, flourishing, prosperous places that are not just carbon negative, but actually store carbon warehouses. In order to do that, we've got to transform the way we build. In order to do that, we've got to transform the way that we procure and plan. We've got to transform the way that there's so much work to do. The notion that as a designer or someone working in the built environment today, you're going to run out of work that needs to be done is so laughable that, it's not even worthy of consideration.
Actually, I think a question to end on would be a good one of sort of transport yourself back to Sheffield University when you're, just starting, just about to graduate and starting in your career. What would be that piece of advice if you could give it to yourself now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've thought about this a lot. One piece of advice I would give myself is that, I don't know if you've heard of the phrase minimum viable product, right? So this is used a lot in sort of agile development. So you might have a big idea for the future, but the first thing that you make is like the most basic working version that people can use right now, and that hopefully you can get paid for, and so you can start, keep working on it. And that's called the minimum viable product. And so one piece of advice I would definitely give myself is that the minimum viable product can be so much more minimum than you ever imagined. Because I think the moment you do that, most people, being brutal, they talk, they don't do.
Yeah.
So the moment you kind of create a prototype, we saw this with WikiHouse. This is one of the kind of joys of open source collaboration, right? You just do a thing, you just publish it online, and boom, within weeks, somebody's cutting a piece on the other side of the world and proving it, and like, whoa. So that's definitely one piece of advice I would probably give myself. I think the other one that I would say is this thing about whatever challenge you set out to try and take on, and it really doesn't matter where you start. Like, start with anything that is obviously not right, not the way it should be. Just start pulling on that string and see what bits of string are connected to that string, right? Once you've seen a bad system, you can't unsee it, right? So then you just kind of fall in love with the problem. But wherever you start and whatever system you get into, at the other end, you will find human nature, like behavior and psychology and law, waiting at the end of the corridor. So it's so much more interesting to not be judging people and saying, oh, here's the bad guys and here's the good guys. It's much more interesting to get into the room with the person who owns the problem and talk to them. And actually try and work with the people who actually own the problem as much as possible.
Brilliant, Alastair. It's been absolutely inspiring. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.